Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here, as we generally do, with our large, damp, square-headed brush. Here I'm using a mixture of titanium white and primary blue. I'm predominantly applying the titanium white to the bottom of the horizon, and then as I move upwards it slowly transitions into more of a blue, which should also progressively get darker and darker. We want the bottom of the horizon to be fairly highlighted, and we want the top of the sky to be fairly dark. Now I'm also taking those colors and applying them to the right hand side of the canvas because we already have them, and it's a lot easier to apply them now than to remix that pigment a little bit later. Then I'm applying some Mars Black to the top of our painting, and I'm going to begin blending it down in an attempt to render another smooth gradient. The goal here is to use a very soft touch of the brush, as adding a lot of pressure can generally render a much more streaky aesthetic. We're able to blend all of these pigments because our brush was initially fairly damp, and that extends the wet life of our pigment and allows us to move them a little bit farther. Then what I'm going to do is switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush. Here you can see that I'm going to begin working on the outlines of my mountains with a pure titanium white, and this time I'm not using any water on my brush. We used a lot in the sky, but we're not going to use any really in the mountain, and that's because I want a much more textured, toothy aesthetic, something that very much implies rock and the subject matter that it is. I get a lot of questions asking me how much water you should incorporate when you're working with acrylics, and the answer is that it's always changing. It's always very dependent on the subject itself. A soft, smooth sky probably requires a lot, whereas something textured like a rock probably might not have any at all. So think about the subject that you're rendering and how soft you want it to be, how textured you want it to be, and then use water accordingly with that in mind. Now here we're applying all of this titanium white to the left-hand side of the mountain because that's where the highlight is going to be coming from. And the right-hand side is going to be very dark. It's all going to be in shadow. And it's important that we do this so that we render depth in our painting. Depth is created when light wraps around a subject, when you have a light tone, a medium tone, a dark tone, and even 100 tones in between. But you need those three initially to really render a fairly realistic depth. So that's what we're doing here. We're now adding in the mid-tone. It's not as bright as the white, but it's also not as dark as the mountain itself, the shadow side of it, if you will. And here we're just trying to interject a little bit of additional detail and add a little bit more depth through subtlety as well. Now we'll have to go back over different areas of this mountain and reincorporate our highlights because acrylic paints dry fairly transparently, as you can see, and because of that, the color that's underneath them tends to show through. So we applied the white and then the black showed through, which ended up rendering something much more akin to a gray. So we're picking some choice areas and we're reapplying our highlights. We're doing this when our pigment is fairly dry, however, because we don't want it to blend a lot. We still want that nice textured aesthetic. And if your underlayer is wet, when you go to apply another layer, you'll probably get something that blends much more, and you won't end up with really what you want. Now here I'm switching over to my medium-sized round-headed brush, and I'm going to begin interjecting some clouds into the bottom. Maybe it's mist. You never really know, but it's a lot softer of an aesthetic. We're using a primary blue, we're using a titanium white, we're using a lot of water because we want it to be fairly transparent, because we want it to be fairly see-through. We want it to have that glowing ethereal effect. And when we're doing this, I'm trying to create different clouds. At the bottom they're much larger. As we move up the mountain they get smaller and smaller, and the interjection of different sizes is really going to make this a lot more interesting. It's going to give the mountain a lot more of a scale. It's going to make it look much more vast. So, also worth noting, the middle of the cloud should look much more dense, while the outsides of them should be much more soft. From there, I am going to switch over to my rake brush, and this is a brush that you can buy at any real art store like Michael's or wherever you may be. But you can also make your own. You can just cut little intervals out of your brush. I actually made mine, and I made a video on it about 3 years ago. So if you want to dig through the channel to find that, you are more than welcome to do so. But here, essentially what it does is renders a litany of strokes by making a single stroke because it has 4 or 5 protruding pieces. So it's fantastic for rendering things like the northern lights here, where we have to do just hundreds of these more vertical strokes. Now, I'm beginning here by using a fairly dark blue. I'm just building up a base, and then we'll go back in later and we'll add in our highlight and the real light of the northern lights here. But we're building up our base, we're figuring out where we want everything to be. While we're doing this, it's important to note that we want it to be always evolving and changing. We don't want all of our strokes to start and stop at the same area. We want some to go higher, some to go lower. We want some more transparent areas within there. We want it to be as diverse as possible, and that'll make it much more realistic and interesting. It's also worth noting that when I go in to make each of these applications, when I first apply the brush to the canvas, I'm being very delicate, I'm being very light. And then as I move towards the middle of the stroke, I apply a little bit more pressure. And I do this to get the pigment to be a little bit more opaque and less transparent. Then as we move down towards the bottom of the stroke, I relieve pressure and lift the brush. So yet again, we get something fairly transparent. The top and the bottom, very see-through. The middle, much more opaque. We do this so we get a bit of a glowing effect. It looks like that middle area is kind of emitting light, and then it dissipates on the top and the bottom. This is a very easy way to render that sort of effect. I'm also using my finger here and there to kind of blend out different areas, ensuring that they are nice and soft. You should only really do this, however, if you find that your lines are a little bit too stark and opaque at the top and the bottom of each application. Now, we're using a good amount of water in this application because we do want our first layers to be A, fairly transparent, but also B, very sharp and defined. We don't want it to be gritty, we don't want it to have that grainy, crackly effect that the mountains have. Each subject should come with its own aesthetic, its own texture, its own amount and requirement for water, and it's important to think about that. The Aurora Borealis here is actually much more akin to the clouds that we have at the bottom, which are much more wet, which are much more transparent, which require more highlights in the middle areas. Here we're actually going back and we're doing that right now. We're adding those highlights into the middle, but we yet again want it to dissipate on both the top and the bottom area. That's really how we're going to render that nice glowing effect. Now, this can take a bit of time, but it's a very cathartic process because you're kind of doing the same thing over and over, but you're just making the painting look better and better. It's something you need to do. It is part of the layering process, and I think a lot of people get frustrated initially when painting because they'll start something and it won't initially look exactly the way they want. But it's not meant to. We're meant to build in layers. We need to build our foundation first, and then we add our highlights, and then we add our details, and then we have a painting that we really love. So enjoy the process through the entirety of it. That is so important. And as you begin to render the paintings that you really love, then it's just an absolutely wonderful experience. Here I'm adding more highlights, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but the Aurora Borealis should be a lot smaller in the distance and it should be much larger in the foreground. We do this because of perspective, because things in the foreground are much larger than things in the background, at least the way we perceive them even when they're the same size, and it's another easy way of kind of working in some depth into our painting. Now here I'm going back and I'm continuing to do that. I'm applying most of the highlights to the foreground of this painting, and I'm doing that because I want the viewer's attention and eye to remain in the foreground. I'm not adding all of the highlights in the background because I don't want the eye to stay there. I want the eye to go to the background, but then I want it to be led back up into the foreground. Speaking of which, the Aurora Borealis here acts as leading lines, because if you follow it from the back of the painting up to the foreground, it leads you into the mountain and into the main subject, which is so important. You should always be thinking about how the line work of other subjects leads the eye into where you want it to go. You don't want it to lead them off the painting, you want it to lead the viewer's eye into the middle of the painting, or into your main subject. Here I'm adding some additional highlights back into the clouds, as you can see, and we're just about out of time. However, I did have one more thing I really wanted to do in this painting, so I thought I'd share that with you as well, and that is simply adding stars. I'm taking a smaller round-headed brush, I'm adding a lot of water, I'm taking a little bit of titanium white paint, I'm peeling back the bristles, and I'm launching these stars at the canvas, rendering our final piece here. With that being said, that is our 10-minute painting. I'd like to say a big thank you for sticking around here with me today. If you'd like to learn more about acrylic painting, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long painting lessons just like this, where I also show you my color palette and when I'm mixing with water, you can find a link to that in my Patreon down below. We now have over 10 episodes up. We're building a great library, and it's a lot of fun. I'd like to say a big thank you again for sticking around. I post every Saturday. I'll see you next Saturday, and above all, stay creative.